Chapter 821, Taming the Fifth Year, Titan's Legacy 5. The preparation had begun during the jump itself, mana already flowing in the necessary patterns while the space distorted around the beast. It was perfect timing that leveraged transition moments to maximize efficiency. The beam fired from what should have been the Terror's completely exposed rear, an angle that most beasts would have difficulty defending because their primary defenses were oriented forward. It should have been a decisive blow that would end the battle immediately, with clean penetration of a defense more inadequate to so much power than the Beetle's. But it encountered an uncomfortable reality at that moment, one that should have been known but forgotten in the speedy reaction, in the heat of the moment. The Terror basically had no true rear in the conventional sense. With its multiple legs distributed around its body and multiple hairs sensing vibrations and mana in an extremely sensitive manner, in a configuration that allowed omnidirectional movement, the creature could respond to threats from any angle almost as effectively as from the front. It wasn't a coincidence that some ambush predators developed that type of advanced sensory adaptation to detect prey they couldn't see. It was an evolutionary advantage that also converted the concept of vulnerable back into an illusion. And Taro had used only 3 of the mineral balls instead of launching them all in the first wave, only the needed to make a jump. It was a strategic reserve that now demonstrated its value when one of the remaining balls was rapidly positioned in the trajectory of the approaching beam, the Terror's leg moving it with speed that revealed the anticipation of exactly this type of counterattack. The Hydra's white and black beam impacted the ball directly. The collision between pure energy attack and the enhanced mineral projectile resulted in a detonation that eclipsed previous explosions in magnitude. The ball destroyed itself completely under the combined beam's assault, fragmenting into pieces that flew in all directions while energy released in a visible shockwave. But the beam was still more potent and continued its trajectory after destroying the obstacle. Power reduced by the expenditure of piercing through the ball, but still sufficient to cause fatal damage. The Terror attempted covering itself with its legs as well, multiple limbs moving to interpose their tips while adjusting the faces of their remaining transformed mineral to divert the beam. And if that didn't work, even using the additional mass of all the extra legs between the beam and its vulnerable body. But the attack was much more powerful than the simple beams the Hydra had used previously, amplified by the combination of opposing elements and by the centrifugal force from the spiral movement that the intertwined energies naturally generated. The legs couldn't stay in place to deflect the beam. On the contrary, they were deflected by the rotation and only managed to reduce its effectiveness partially before it pierced the improvised defenses. It struck the Terror directly, impacting the creature's central body with force that made it withdraw several steps while its low number of remaining legs desperately adjusted to maintain balance. The Terror shrieked, a sound that was a disturbing mix of multiple harmonic tones that made several spectators shudder involuntarily. It was a genuine pain cry from a creature that rarely showed vulnerability so clearly. Sections of the chitinous exoskeleton had been destroyed and burned where the beam had penetrated, blackened areas communicating damage that would take time to heal properly. But Taro hadn't kept 2 balls, maybe by accident or simple excessive precaution. No, he'd kept them specifically for this scenario, anticipating that Run would try to capitalize on his jump with a powerful counterattack. And so, there remained a second ball in the air that had been launched at the precise same moment the other was fighting the beam. The second ball impacted the Hydra on its left flank while the beast was still sustaining the combined beam, before it could reposition or establish an appropriate defense. The amplified mana explosion detonated against the diamond scales with concentrated force, projectile energy, plus additional power from the enhanced mineral, creating an impact that exceeded what its passive defense could completely absorb without damage. The Hydra was launched laterally by the impact's force, its massive body dragging across the ground while trying to recover stability. One of the heads roared in pain, while the other growled with fury, both expressions communicating that this exchange had caused real damage that couldn't be ignored. A new dust cloud rose from the impact point where the Hydra had been struck and from the area where it had landed after being launched, obscuring vision of the field for the umpteenth time in this extended battle. It was a dramatic moment where the outcome of the mutual exchange wasn't immediately visible again, making Finch and Theodore shudder in their seats. In the VIP section, several noble families watched with particular intensity. This wasn't just a student exam anymore. This was a demonstration of the next generation's capabilities, a preview of the power that would shape the kingdom's military and political landscape in coming years. And what they were seeing was unprecedented. Taro as a powerful double was one thing, but they needed to do something about that kid with the red hair. When the dust cloud began clearing gradually, the first thing that became apparent from Ren's Hydra side was a glow that was intensifying. It wasn't simply a reflection of sunlight on the diamond scales, but something deeper, emanating from within the Hydra's body. A glow that spun in a manner those who'd paid attention to the battle would recognize immediately. The Hydra was recharging from the internal mana of its core again. It was using the accelerated recovery techniques again to be able to stand and continue. Taro was almost kneeling. Not completely collapsed, but clearly in serious difficulty, his body leaning more on one leg. The pain of his two broken bonds resonated through him with intensity that made it difficult to remain conscious and focused. First the beetle, then the terror shortly after, both gold ring connections severed violently in a space of few minutes. It was the type of pain that would leave any tamer completely incapacitated. But Taro held firm. He sustained his body through pure force of will as the dust continued receding. Chapter 822, Taming the Fifth Year, Titan's Legacy, End. The Hydra had received enormous damage on its flank where the enhanced mineral ball had impacted. As the dust settled more, the extent of the damage became increasingly evident. The diamond scales in that area were severely broken or had simply fallen off completely, leaving underlying tissue exposed. It was a serious wound that communicated exactly how much force that final terror projectile had carried. But both Ren and Taro knew, evaluating the situation, that with a bit of additional mana recovered in elemental water healing, the Hydra could continue fighting. Not at 100% effectiveness, the damage was too extensive to heal everything during combat, but sufficient to finish with the 8 remaining opponents before Leora entered at the end of the line. The Hydra still had resources and could still generate attacks that would eliminate opponents of level inferior to its own easily. This was a victory for Run. Not clean, not without cost, but victory nonetheless. The Terror had fought valiantly and had caused more damage than many would have anticipated. But it hadn't been sufficient to change the fundamental outcome of this confrontation between Titans. Rin was beginning to order the Hydra to start basic healing of the damaged flank as soon as the mana was enough when he noticed an unusual expression on Taro's face. His friend was smiling. Not a smile of accepted defeat, but something more insidious. And then, in the last moment before Run could react appropriately, something emerged from what remained of the dust cloud. An enormous lance, not projected, but thrown with force that made the air whistle around its passage. Speed that converted the object into a barely visible blur, crossing the distance between where the Terror had been and where the Hydra was trying to stabilize. The lance pierced through the Hydra directly, exiting through the same flank that was already damaged. It penetrated the scales with ease, sinking deeply into the beast's body until only the base was visible protruding from the entry point. It was a devastating blow that converted the serious wound into critical instantly. The Hydra's heads lashed the ground violently when its legs gave out beneath it. They'd been trying to rise, to reposition for the next phase of battle, but the sudden impact, the massive pain, and the paralyzing venom that came with the attack eliminated any possibility of that. The Hydra collapsed heavily, its considerable mass striking the earth with a sound that resonated through the field. When the dust finally cleared sufficiently to see the attack's source, what was revealed made several spectators inhale sharply with recognition of what they'd just witnessed. What remained of the Terror, already disintegrating into light particles as its physical existence dissolved, had the internal bloody tip of that powerful proboscis pointing directly toward the Hydra. But it was mostly no longer part of the terror. Its head had unfolded and exploded to launch it. The characteristic proboscis of the beast, that long and incredibly hard appendage that had been the object of men's mockery in the past, now demonstrated exactly why Run had convinced Taro to perfect its use. The fired proboscis, now piercing through the Hydra, was covered at its tip with the special mineral the beetle had created and that the terror had enhanced. The proboscis by itself was a powerful weapon above its rank, a natural capability of the species that allowed it to penetrate defenses that should stop it. It could pierce even hard diamonds at gold rank when applied correctly, and probably could pierce the gold 2 or gold 3 mana reinforced diamond of a wild Hydra. With the enhanced mineral amplifying its effectiveness, the penetration had been absolute. It had pierced through the diamond scales as if they were ordinary crystals instead of the material that had resisted massive previous attacks. The terror had learned to fire its proboscis connected to that viscous substance that could extend to considerable distance. It wouldn't be able to absorb energy from the Hydra and regenerate its broken body this time after using the technique, as it would need to be closer so the tissues connected to the lance wouldn't be so destroyed. The cost of launching it so far this time was too high, and the damage it had received from the previous beam to its thorax was too extensive. But it was an ability that would improve with time as the terror strengthened and learned to execute it more efficiently without damaging itself. Rin sighed while observing the terror disappear almost completely into dispersing particles along with the mineral-covered proboscis lance in his Hydra's flank. He thought that Taro had grown incredibly well. He couldn't imagine how difficult it would be to face this combination later, when Taro had refined the techniques even more and when the beasts were at superior ranks. Because with the two beasts together or eventually fused, there would be no real limitations on how much mineral could be generated and utilized. And as the beasts continued growing, the mineral would be more and more powerful, resonating with shared bonds and multiplying its effectiveness in ways that were only beginning to generate now. In the end, that enhanced organic mineral could become the hardest material with the greatest mana accumulation available in nature. It was a potential that was barely being touched in this battle, but that promised extraordinary development in the future. But the present battle still hadn't completely finished. Ren needed the venom to exit with the Hydra's blood before the paralysis wore off, and it could heal the enormous hole in its flank. But then he noticed that Taro wasn't collapsing yet. He was resisting so the terror wouldn't disappear completely despite the obvious pain of his broken bonds. Instead, his friend was raising his hand in a clear signal directed toward his allies on his side of the field. The next in line on Taro's team recognized the signal immediately and ran toward the field without waiting for the teacher's confirmation. It was a movement that technically didn't violate protocol, but that communicated something everyone understood instantly. Ren realized with cold recognition what Taro was doing. He was enduring as much as he could with the terror's bond, still technically active, keeping it manifested even if partially for the time sufficient for the next opponent to reach an appropriate position. Because the Hydra wasn't just wounded, but also immobile due to the paralyzing venom that the terror's proboscis had injected during its penetration. It was the last service the terror could provide before disappearing completely, leaving the Hydra in a state where even a significantly weaker opponent could eliminate it with any appropriate attack. Chapter 823, Taming the Fifth Year, Passing the Torch. Taro finished enduring until the next boy was in position with his beast manifested and ready to attack. And only then, when he'd completely fulfilled his tactical role, did he finally allow the bonds to be severed entirely. He collapsed onto one knee, breathing heavily, sweat covering his face. But there was a smile on that face despite the pain and defeat. He'd done what needed to be done, had pushed Ren's golden beast to his absolute limits, had wounded it critically in those final moments, and had set up his teammate for a clean elimination that would force Ren to face the remaining battles with one less beast available. had established a situation where his team still had a chance of victory if the following combatants executed appropriately. It was the best outcome Taro could have achieved given the circumstances. Rin grabbed his hair with momentary frustration, but was also smiling while observing his tenacious friend. Always giving him problems. Always pushing him to be better. It was exactly why their friendship was so valuable, why training with Taro had been so beneficial for both during all this time. He assessed the situation rapidly through his bond with the paralyzed Hydra. The beast was alive, but critically wounded. The proboscis had pierced through vital areas, the enhanced mineral tip having caused internal damage beyond what was immediately visible. The paralyzing venom was spreading through its system, locking muscles and preventing movement. And the battles continued without pause, the teacher recognizing that momentum needed to be maintained given the combatant strategy. The next student attacked the paralyzed Hydra immediately, his beast launching an elemental fire projectile that should have been resisted or avoided easily in normal circumstances. But the Hydra couldn't move appropriately with the venom running through its system. Even so, Rin managed to make it fire a beam even while lying down, orienting one of the heads toward the incoming opponent. The light beam emerged with reduced force, but sufficient, and Rin ingeniously used earth control and the shot's thrust to reposition the Hydra's head slightly, rotating it just enough so the enemy projectile got destroyed and didn't impact the exposed flesh while his own attack eliminated the opponent. But the second opponent entered more rapidly, all the others already in line, trying to maintain the battle active with not a second of rest. This opponent was more dangerous, using wood element roots that would have type advantage against the Hydra's base earth element, which despite being omni-elemental now, still maintained a certain inclination toward its two initial elements. But by the time the roots were completely trapping the Hydra, Rin executed a light jump with the Hydra again, massive mana expenditure that left the beast's reserves dangerously low but allowed repositioning just behind the attacker, eliminating the second opponent with a weak but clean shot. Against the third, however, the Hydra no longer had sufficient mana to continue. The venom had been partially processed, but the physical damage it couldn't heal due to constant battle was too extensive. Without being able to heal appropriately, without resources for more powerful attacks, and with the enormous hole the Terror's lance had left in its flank, plus the accumulated damage from the mineral ball on its diamond defenses, it took only any attack from the next beast to finally eliminate the Hydra. Rin withdrew it before the final blow connected completely, to avoid additional damage and unnecessary pain. And now Rin had to bring out the Mantis, his most versatile beast, but also most fragile in many aspects. And there still remained 6 opponents he'd have to remove before he could even think about facing Leora at the end of the line. The battle was far from finished, and Rin, feeling the bond with the Hydra so weakened, mentally prepared himself for the extended phase that would require everything he had left to overcome. Taro observed from his collapsed position as they carried him away to rest, with genuine satisfaction despite the defeat of his 2 powerful beasts. He'd done his job, had worn down the Titan, had demonstrated that even Rin Patender could be pushed to his limits. Now it depended on the rest of the team to capitalize on the advantage he'd created. Attrition strategy. The Mantis moved through the 7 lesser opponents like a green storm that left no opportunity for appropriate responses. No silver rank beast could lose it despite being only bronze 2 when the versatility difference was so pronounced. The inevitable result from before beginning. But what they did accomplish despite their individual defeats was wearing it down and tiring it somewhat. Each battle required the Mantis to move, attack, dodge. Each exchange spent some mana, even if victories came relatively quickly. And the general strategy they'd employed under Leora's coordination from her position at the end of the line had been defensive from the start, designed specifically to tire the Mantis instead of trying to loss it directly. The beasts focused on surviving as long as possible, forcing the Mantis to pay for each elimination. They established defenses that had to be penetrated, created distance that had to be closed, executed suicide attacks that required the Mantis to adjust its last attacks midway. It was death by 1,000 cuts in terms of accumulated fatigue, where that built slowly but consistently with each successive opponent. The strategy did little to keep the beasts alive for long, that had been recognized from the start as impossible. Even the most resistant of the group eventually fell under the Mantis's rapid cuts, insane speed and precision, finding weak points that no silver defense could completely protect. The Mantis was also difficult to detect when using invisibility, difficult to resist when its claws connected with force amplified by elements advantageous against any of its opponents. But they had fulfilled their purpose. The Mantis was breathing more heavily now than it had been at the start. Its movements remained fast, but there was a minor loss of maximum velocity that trained eyes could detect. Its mana reserves were somewhat reduced after eliminating 6 opponents consecutively without appropriate opportunity for recovery between battles. And the audience was now much more invested in the fight than in any of Ren's previous battles during this exam. Because this one was more balanced than the vast majority had been, real equilibrium where the outcome wasn't predetermined but genuinely uncertain. Ren could lose this time. Chapter 824, Taming the Fifth Year, The Torch. It was a possibility that had been theoretically present in previous battles, but had never felt as plausible as now. His parents, seated in the special section near Selphra, had been observing with pride and concern throughout the day. They were natural worrywarts when it came to their only son. But even they were already accustomed to seeing Ren handle challenges with confidence and hadn't felt the adrenaline that now made them clench their fists unconsciously. Could their son win this time? Rarely was the new Ren seen in genuine combat distress. Without doubt, this team structure that forced individual combatants to face waves of opponents had been good for pushing him to limits in ways one-on-one confrontations would never achieve. It was ironic in a certain sense. The opportunistic nobles had proposed changes to the exam format during their machinations, and perhaps they had been onto something with that specific suggestion, though sad for them that it no longer had much impact so late in the year when it was about to end and their political influence was severely reduced. The Mantis had eliminated the 9th opponent with a clean cut that separated the head from the body of its beast. And now, after this prolonged warm-up, the moment everyone had been anticipating had finally arrived. Leora walked onto the field with confidence that came from knowing exactly what cards she had available and how to use them optimally. She was the last opponent, a position she herself had chosen when Taro and she had decided their positions in the line. Not because she was weaker than Taro and needed protection from being at the end, but because her specific beasts were particularly effective as finishers. And as Ren had feared when he saw the initial arrangement, Leora had left the bash for the end of her own beasts as well. That terrifying creature that could absorb mana from fallen beasts and strengthen itself as battle progressed would be her closing card if they reached that point. But first would come her other beast, the one Ren recognized immediately when Leora manifested it in an explosion of energy that made the temperature around the field increase noticeably. The Will-O-Wisp, now at gold rank after months and years that had elevated it from its modest beginnings at iron rank. The spirit that had been bright blue when Leora originally acquired it was now more purple, a tonality that communicated fundamental transformation in its nature. Ren thought, while observing the manifestation, that the change was due to the spirit's constant interaction with the bash's demonic energy. Maintaining 2 beasts with contrary energies bonded to the same tamer inevitably caused them to influence each other, to balance, particularly when one of them emanated a presence as strong as that of the giant demonic serpent. The spirit had become something more neutral than purely good, not as close to the black miasma of the serpent, but also not as pure as the blue that had characterized it in its most initial levels. It was an evolution that intrigued Ren slightly in terms of what it meant for the creature's fundamental nature, but that he also knew greatly increased the potential for capabilities that normal spirits wouldn't develop. The Will-O-Wisp still didn't have a very defined form despite having reached gold rank. It had simply grown more and more with the levels, accumulating spiritual mass without crystallizing into a specific configuration. Now, it was an enormous and threatening ball of purple fire that floated over the field with a presence that made the air around it undulate visibly from the intense heat. It had weak form manipulation capabilities it had developed recently. It could elongate like a serpent when it needed additional reach, extension of its body that maintained coherence while stretching several meters. It could create what looked like long hands that emerged from its central mass, appendages that could grab or strike though they lacked defined fingers. And sometimes it manifested what could only be described as a macabre mouth, an opening on its surface that gaped with the recommendation of teeth formed by more intense flames. But not much beyond those basic manipulations. The spirit hadn't reached a point where it could assume a completely different form like some elemental spirits eventually achieved. Ren wondered, observing the purple mass fluctuate slightly while Leora completed the manifestation. If when he finally recovered his mushroom, he could see the initial draconic form of such a spiritual creature. He'd had an idea when he could still see information in interaction with the mushroom. That purple lizard silhouette could become a black fire dragon. A dragon made completely of black fire in a shifting silhouette would be incredibly cool in his opinion, though perhaps it was a form more appreciated by boys than girls generally. He thought of Larissa and her beautiful light fairy, another jumper but elegant and ethereal creature that fit perfectly with more refined aesthetic sensibilities. Completely different from the terrifying fire dragon Ren imagined. But thinking of Leora and how she had many tastes that aligned more with typically masculine preferences, a personality that didn't fit perfectly in the simple feminine or conventional category. He could easily imagine her happy too about how cool a spiritual dragon would look instead of wanting something more traditionally beautiful. The immediate problem, however, wasn't speculation about future beast forms, but how to deal with the present enemy that already represented a serious threat to the mantis in its current configuration. Common water wouldn't work against spiritual fire. Ren knew it, and already many people had also seen the will-o-wisp simply pass through elemental water attacks and other battles and exams from past years without being significantly affected. The spirit didn't operate under the same rules as ordinary physical fire. Its immaterial nature allowed it to ignore counter-elements that would normally be effective. Ren had two viable options. He could use light combined with water, elemental purification that would affect the limited corrupt nature the spirit had developed. But that would be revealing more cards than he wanted to show publicly. A demonstration of light control in all his beasts was perhaps too much. Or he could attempt to heal Leora's beast directly, using a healer's mana pattern to the point where water would work appropriately. But that would be much less efficient than simply attacking with light alone or combined with water from the start, and would be considerably more risky because it would require approaching closer than he'd normally attempt against an opponent of this type. Leora didn't give him time to finish evaluating options completely. Chapter 825, Taming the Fifth Year, Spirit of the Torch. As soon as the will-o-wisp's manifestation completed, Leora ordered an attack without preamble or threatening posture that would telegraph any intention. The spirit simply disappeared from its initial position and reappeared directly above the mantis, an enormous mass of purple fire descending like an incandescent avalanche. It was the signature danger of the will-o-wisp that made it particularly terrifying to face. Practically instantaneous teleportation that converted any distance on the battlefield into something irrelevant. The spirit could be on one side of the field one moment and literally on top of an opponent the next with almost no visible transition between states. The mantis reacted with speed that came from instincts honed by countless battles. It covered itself with healing water, a protective layer that Ren had ordered manifested in the milliseconds available before impact. Simultaneously, it fired itself with wind element, propulsion that launched it laterally out of the direct trajectory of the bite that the spiritual fire had formed, that macabre opening that had materialized specifically to engulf the mantis. Ren's beast exited the initial attack by scant centimeters, healing water hissing where the fire had grazed, but fulfilling its purpose of preventing direct damage to the mantis's exoskeleton. And then the terrible battle truly began. An exchange that would demonstrate exactly why Leora's will-o'-wisp was considered one of the most difficult threats to handle among all the beast's fifth-year students possessed. Because the worst thing about the will-o'-wisp, what converted it from simply dangerous to a tactical nightmare, was that it was the largest beast that could teleport most frequently of all. Its mass was really very little despite its impressive size visually, being composed of spiritual energy instead of physical matter. And that meant it demanded nearly no mana expenditure on jumps compared to what it would cost to teleport a physical beast of similar size. It was a true expert in harassment and speed, capable of appearing, attacking, and disappearing before any counterattack could be executed appropriately, and then appearing again from a completely different angle half a second later, continuous pressure that didn't allow a moment for recovery or any extended planning. The mantis had barely landed from its initial dodge when it realized the fire was already jumping on it again, purple mass materializing directly in its landing trajectory, as if Leora had predicted exactly where it would be. And even with the healing water layer that remained maintained, actively consuming mana constantly, damage was beginning to seep into the shield bit by bit. The fire wasn't just hot. It was corrosive in a spiritual sense, eating away at the water's protective healing properties through its partially tainted nature. The hybrid state between pure and demonic that made it more difficult to defend against with only natural elemental counters. Ren ordered another evasion, the mantis launching itself backward with wind propulsion while simultaneously creating distance. But the will-o'-wisp was already there again, having teleported to intercept the retreat before the mantis could establish safe range. It was like fighting a ghost that could be everywhere at once. No, worse than a ghost, a being with massive size and the ability to engulf its target completely if given the opportunity. The mantis twisted midair, blade-like limbs slashing at the purple fire as it passed through the space where the spirit had just appeared. The attacks connected, cutting through the spiritual mass and dispersing portions of it momentarily. But the will-o'-wisp simply reformed, pulling its essence back together in less than a second. The damage was superficial, barely slowing it down. Leora watched from her position with focused concentration, directing her beast faster than normal reaction times could track. Ren recognized a problem immediately. The mantis couldn't win through attrition. Every exchange favored the will-o'-wisp because it could attack, retreat, and reset with lower cost or even without meaningful cost at all. Meanwhile, the mantis was burning through stamina and mana, maintaining the defensive water layers and executing constant speedy but linear evasions. The math was simple and brutal. This was a losing battle if it continued at this pace. He needed to change the dynamics. Maybe needed to create a situation where the will-o'-wisp couldn't just teleport freely, or needed to force a decisive exchange instead of allowing this barrage to continue wearing down the mantis until exhaustion made defense impossible. Slow but inevitable accumulation that would eventually penetrate completely if the mantis didn't find a way to escape the harassment pattern. Since no matter what rapid maneuvers it executed, no matter how it tried to hide, using invisibility that normally made it almost impossible to track, the will-o'-wisp simply appeared in its trajectory in the next instant, covering it with heat that exceeded any defense healing water could provide consistently. The invisibility didn't affect the spirit at all because it could see the mana of other beasts directly, perception that transcended normal physical senses. The mantis could be invisible to ordinary eyes, but shone like a beacon to a creature that perceived the world purely in terms of energy. Ren observed the exchange with growing recognition that this would be significantly more difficult than he'd anticipated. And in the stands, tension increased as everyone realized the same thing. But Ren had been considering it since his battle against Taro. The will-o'-wisp could see energy directly, which meant hiding wasn't a viable option no matter how much invisibility the mantis manifested, so it had run out of options. But there was another approach that could work if he was willing to pay the price of revelation that would come with it. Deciding in that moment that if he'd already used light and darkness with the Hydra publicly, then the Mantis could use them too. Because surely he'd have to use the Wolverine the same way when the moment came to manifest his third beast. It was a big commitment he'd been avoiding until now, but that present circumstances made necessary. Because his friends were already very strong, that had been clearly demonstrated by Taro and now Leora. Chapter 826, Taming the Fifth Year, Spirit of the Torch, 2. He couldn't lower his guard, needed to use everything he had available if he wanted to win without risking a premature defeat in this tournament that would damage not only his pride a bit, but also give the nobles reasons to talk. While they could no longer deny he deserved the rewards, it could generate more difficulties in managing his territory. And especially, he wanted to indulge his parents by winning, didn't want to betray the new trust they placed in him. But there was also a more analyzed reason for this decision. He wouldn't run out of secrets or options. He'd keep thunder, ice, and other more advanced combined elements as hidden cards for the future. Light and darkness would have to be shown in all his beasts eventually anyway, because they were the fundamental base to many of the techniques he planned to develop later. He could reveal them now and perhaps improve them soon, so he wouldn't be left so exposed. Ren had been thinking about this throughout the entire battle against Taro and the other boys on his friend's team, his mind working in the background while his conscious focus handled immediate combat. And he'd realized with growing clarity that wasting the Mantis here could be his defeat in the end when he faced Leora's bash if the Wolverine arrived tired. He needed the Mantis operating closer to maximum of its capabilities, not contained by artificial restrictions on what elements it could use publicly. He'd placed everything on an imaginary table in his mind, evaluating pros and cons. The biggest problem that could arise from revealing more Mantis capabilities was that enemies would finally understand that his three beasts had total access to all 7 elements without exception. Light and darkness completely integrated. It was a conceptual leap that would force astute observers to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how his cultivation worked. And probably now, yes, they would connect without any doubt those capabilities with his jade mana, that distinctive color that didn't fit normality. They would have almost complete certainty that the old legend Selphra had spoken about regarding different mana from antiquity, that lost knowledge that supposedly had existed, could be more directly related to Run than they'd previously speculated. What that would generate as consequence was that they'd take him more seriously, elevate the level of attention they paid him to the point of treating him as a threat or resource comparable to Luna and her genetic key, or possibly worse. They would seek more aggressively ways to use him, to control access to what he represented, to ensure that any benefit coming from his unique capabilities would flow toward them instead of toward competitors. But Ren had realized during his analysis that this no longer changed much in practical terms. He'd successfully repaired an ancient artifact with demonstrated success, a feat that had already put eyes on him in a way that couldn't be reversed. And he was about to receive an enormous quantity of rewards for his achievements, resources, and recognition that would elevate him significantly in political and military hierarchies regardless of anything else he did. If they didn't have him in their sights, at maximum already after all that, then they were blind or incompetent in ways that made them a lesser threat than he'd anticipated. The additional revelation of complete elemental control would simply confirm what sharper minds already suspected. It didn't change the fundamental equation of his situation. So the decision was clear when evaluated coldly. Use almost everything available now. Win this battle in a way that demonstrated more capabilities and deal with political consequences later when he had more time and resources to handle them appropriately. Ren made his choice. Light and darkness. He ordered through the bond. Full integration. Show them what you can do with them. The Mantis understood immediately, recognizing through their connection that more restrictions were being lifted, that it could finally use a bigger spectrum of capabilities it had been developing under Ren's careful cultivation, but keeping suppressed in public demonstrations. The change was subtle at first, a shimmer across the mantis's jade-colored exoskeleton as the light element began flowing more freely through its form. The mantis's blade limbs and water shield began to glow with pale luminescence, light element concentrating along their edges in a way that made them appear sharper, more defined. Simultaneously, shadows gathered around the segments of its body, darkness element providing counterbalance that enhanced mobility and reduced the visibility of its movements even without active camouflage. In the stands, several observers leaned forward with renewed interest. Those with sufficient expertise recognized immediately what they were seeing. "Is that?" someone murmured. "Light and darkness. Both." Simultaneously, another replied, voice carrying note of disbelief. "Not just the Hydra. The mantis too." Which most likely means. The implications rippled through the more knowledgeable observers like shockwave. One beast having access to opposing elements could be explained as unique evolutionary adaptation or rare mutation. Two beasts demonstrating the same capability suggested something fundamentally different about the Tamer's mana itself. In the shadows, far from the main stands where the majority of spectators observed with attention focused on battle, in a less visible section reserved for observers who preferred maintaining low profile, a figure dressed in a manner that wouldn't draw particular attention held a small notebook. They had been watching the battles, especially Wren's, throughout the day, with specific instructions to report any significant developments immediately. And what they just witnessed when the mantis began using light and darkness after the Hydra had already demonstrated access to both elements definitely qualified as significant. The observer spoke in a low voice, words barely audible even to someone seated directly beside them in the noisy stands. Additional confirmation. The mantis now also exhibits complete control over light and darkness. That makes two beasts with access to all 7 traditional elements without apparent limitation. They continued with a tone bearing the weight of the important conclusions reached. From this point, probability increases to 99.999% that Patender hasn't simply discovered a strange species of Hydra with unusual capabilities, as some had speculated. His mana itself is what's marked in that mural. They discreetly produced a small bird. Continuing observation. If the third beast demonstrates the same pattern when manifested, then we'll eliminate the small remaining uncertainty completely. The observer tore off the page, storing the notebook discreetly while tying the message to the bird and sending it flying, then returned their focus to the battle below. Chapter 827, Taming the Fifth Year, Spirit of the Torch 3. Wren channeled the decision he'd made into clear instructions through the bond with the mantis. The beast responded immediately, understanding without need for extensive elaboration what it needed to do. The sides that serve as the mantis's primary weapons, those sharpened extensions of its exoskeleton that could cut through defenses that would stop conventional ones, began igniting with brilliant light. It wasn't simply external illumination, but a manifestation of elements integrated directly into the weapons. Light flowing through the sides like energy waiting to be released in a devastating cut. The intensity increased with each second while the mantis prepared the next exchange, brightness eventually reaching a point where several spectators had to squint to observe without discomfort. And then the mantis disappeared. Not with conventional invisibility it had been using until now, but with a shadow jump, a completely different technique that operated under principles that defying normal physical understanding. The mantis's body behaved strangely during the transition between light and shadow, its existence becoming ambiguous in ways that made it difficult to track even for a creature that perceived the world purely in terms of spiritual energy. Because in shadow jumps, the mantis didn't simply move faster than eyes could follow. It became shadow temporarily, a state where its presence in the physical world was questionable and its mana signature fluctuated and didn't follow predictable patterns. It was as if it stretched here and there, as if it existed and didn't exist simultaneously during the fraction of a second it took to complete the jump. The mantis used that strange property of shadow jumping deliberately to deceive the spirit's vision that sought energy directly. When its mana fluctuated between states during transition, the will-o-wisp lost the capacity to track it with the perfect certainty it had demonstrated until now. It was a brief moment of confusion where the spirit searched for a clear signal of where its target had gone. And in that moment of confusion, the mantis emerged from the shadows in a position the will-o-wisp hadn't anticipated, sides glowing with light that now served double purpose. Not only as a weapon, but as deliberate contrast against the darkness from which it had just emerged, enmity of light and darkness used together in a way that amplified the effectiveness of both. The sides cut through the will-o-wisp with power that hadn't been possible before when the mantis depended only on physical speed and attacks to close the distance and hit. The spirit shrieked, a sound that was more vibration in the air than real voice, manifestation of pain that a creature without physical form could express. The light integrated into the sides didn't simply cut, but burned spiritual essence in a way ordinary elements couldn't, penetration that went beyond superficial damage. The will-o-wisp attempted to teleport immediately, escape before a second cut could connect. But the mantis was ready for that, had anticipated the response based on the pattern the spirit had established during previous exchanges too. It jumped to shadows again, just as the fire disappeared, following it through the transition with timing that suggested instinctive understanding of how the spirit's teleportation worked. They reappeared almost simultaneously, the mantis emerging from shadows in the same moment the will-o-wisp materialized in a new position. And the sides cut again before the spirit could adjust. A second blow connecting with force that dispersed a portion of the will-o-wisp's mass temporarily. Leora frowned from her position, immediately recognizing that the battle's dynamics had fundamentally changed. Her will-o-wisp no longer had the absolute advantage that teleportation speed had provided when a mantis depended on conventional physical movement. Now, they were operating on a more level field where both could appear and disappear with similar ease, and where the mantis had weapons that could damage spiritual essence. It was a revelation of capabilities Leora hadn't fully anticipated. She'd known Run had access to light and darkness with the mantis, but had assumed the damage from that specific beast would be relatively weak. Seeing the mantis demonstrate the same complete elemental control forced the re-evaluation of what she was facing. And in the stands, murmurs began propagating as implications of what they were witnessing settled into the minds of more astute observers. Ren Patender didn't just have a powerful beast with exceptional elemental control. He had multiple beasts, apparently all with access to the complete spectrum of elements without restrictions that limited ordinary tamers. It was a legend that defied conventional understanding of how cultivation worked. And while few in the audience could articulate exactly what that meant in terms of underlying mechanisms, everyone recognized they were witnessing something fundamentally different from what they'd seen before. The mantis continued pressing its newly established advantage, light size cutting through the will-o-wisp repeatedly while jumping between shadows to maintain the element of surprise. The superior jade mirror mantis continued its implacable assault, and Leora's will-o-wisp began showing signs of accumulated damage it couldn't ignore indefinitely. So Leora used more power, burning stronger, brighter, and affecting the shadows, which now danced to its rhythm. It stopped the mantis first, but before Leora could capitalize, it used an additional ability it hadn't used extensively during the battle until this moment. A capability that wasn't particularly offensive in its majority and that many had considered minor utility when the beast was at higher ranks. It was its illusion ability, that subtle manipulation of light that allowed creating false images that confused the visual perception of opponents. In early ranks, the ability had been relatively simple, basically optical tricks that worked against creatures depending on ordinary vision, but that failed completely against anything with alternative senses. A skill that would only become a truly useful elemental preference for damage when the mantis reached high silver and began being able to infuse the illusions with real elemental energy that exploded instead of simply manipulating ambient light with its mirrors. But even so, the illusions remained as a last resort tool or distraction tactic when more direct approaches didn't work. However, with Ren's teachings channeling additional mana specifically to amplify the ability, the Mantis could create complete energetic clones in many places. They weren't simply images without substance, but manifestations that carried sufficient energy to register as real presences when the will-o-wisp perceived them. Each clone glowed with a mana signature that simulated the true Mantis, making it almost impossible to distinguish which was real and which were fabrications without examining each one carefully. The will-o-wisp's advantage of perceiving the world through energy rather than physical sight suddenly became a double-edged sword. Chapter 828, Taming the Fifth Year, Spirit of the Torch 4. It could see the mana signatures clearly. But when 5 identical signatures surrounded it from different angles, all moving with the same fluid grace, all carrying the same light-infused sides, the spirit couldn't determine which to target. Leora's eyes widened as she recognized the problem. Her beast was being overwhelmed not by superior power, but by superior tactics. The field filled with multiple Mantises, dozens of copies moving simultaneously in patterns that weren't synchronized but deliberately varied. And the real Mantis was hidden somewhere among those clones, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Some jumped through shadows as the original had been doing. Others ran, physically using speed amplified by wind. Several remained immobile in threatening positions, suggesting preparation for ambush. The will-o-wisp, which had been relying on its capacity to track energy directly to counter the Mantis's invisibility, now faced a completely different problem. It could see all the mana signatures clearly. Too clearly. The information overload made it difficult to process which target should be prioritized, especially when all the copies moved convincingly and all seemed equally threatening. Leora attempted filtering information through her connection with the spirit, trying to identify which Mantis carried real physical mass versus which were pure energy without substance behind the appearance. But Ren had been careful in how he structured the clones, giving them sufficient presence that the distinction wasn't obvious even under focused scrutiny. The true Mantis took advantage of the confusion immediately. While the will-o-wisp hesitated, trying to decide which target to attack, the Mantis positioned itself for an attack that would exploit the temporary opening. Its sides glowed with concentrated light it had been accumulating during the spirit's moment of distraction, preparation for a cut that would carry all the power it could channel in a single blow. And it attacked from an angle that 3 different clones were also approaching simultaneously, making it impossible for the will-o-wisp to know with certainty which was real until the sides were already connecting. The cut penetrated deeply into the spirit's mass, dispersing a considerable portion of its form and causing damage that made Leora feel sharp pain through the bond. The Mantis was pressing now with the advantage the illusions provided, forcing the will-o-wisp to defend against multiple threats when only one was real, but all seemed equally dangerous. Each second the spirit spent verifying if a target was genuine was a second where the real Mantis could reposition for the next attack. It was psychological warfare as much as physical combat, mental attrition that accumulated even when physical damage was limited. The will-o-wisp managed to connect a solid blow, burning mass enveloping one of the clones and discovering it was false when it dispersed without resistance. But by the time it completed that verification, another attack from the real Mantis was already connecting from a completely different direction. Leora observed with growing frustration as her most versatile beast was forced into defensive position against an opponent that should have been overcome by the advantage of base strength and faster teleportation. The Mantis had found a way to neutralize that advantage using a combination of shadow jumps and clones that converted the will-o-wisp's pure speed into disadvantage when each movement could be toward a false target. And the Mantis managed to press hard enough to cause additional damage with each successful exchange. Slow, but consistent accumulation that reduced the will-o-wisp's effectiveness as spiritual essence was eroded by light-infused cuts. But Leora hadn't reached this point without having her own resources saved for emergencies. She'd been avoiding using her secret weapon because the cost was considerable. But present circumstances left no option if she wanted to secure victory here. Leora channeled a specific command through the bond. Instruction the Will-O-Wisp immediately recognized as a signal to execute a technique they'd been perfecting for months, but that had never been used in real combat before an audience. The next time the mantis attacked, sides cutting toward the spirit's mass, the Will-O-Wisp became untouchable. Not a conventional dodge or block, but fundamental transformation of its state of existence. The fire stopped being a semi-solid mass of spiritual energy and became something more ethereal, a form that existed at the boundary between materiality and pure energy. The mantis's sides passed through the spirit without encountering resistance, cutting empty air where a moment before there had been a solid target. And in that instant of confusion, when the mantis tried to understand what had failed, the Will-O-Wisp exploded. Not gradual dispersion or controlled energy release, but massive detonation that liberated a considerable portion of the spirit's mass in a point-blank explosion. It was a deliberate sacrifice of its own substance and energy to cause devastating damage to an enemy that was too close to dodge when the attack manifested without prior telegraph. The explosion engulfed the mantis completely, spiritual heat penetrating defenses that had resisted the fire's conventional attacks up to this point. Because the mantis had a prodigious attack that made it capable of damaging opponents much stronger than itself when its blows connected appropriately. But its defense was mediocre compared to beasts of similar rank. Thin exoskeleton optimized for speed instead of resistance to damage. When the explosion dissipated sufficiently to see the result, the mantis was on the ground. Its body showed extensive damage where the fire had burned through sections of the exoskeleton, blackened areas communicating how much energy had penetrated its inadequate defenses. It was at death's door, barely conscious through the bond that Ren felt fracturing under the weight of the accumulated damage. Leora hadn't wanted to use a technique so costly, but she'd had no other option when the mantis had proven more problematic than she'd anticipated. It was a choice between spending resources now to secure victory or risking defeat, while that wouldn't matter if she lost anyway. The mantis attempted to rise, battle instinct pushing it to continue fighting despite damage that should have left it completely incapacitated. It managed to half-raise itself, one of its front legs trembling with the effort of supporting weight while it tried to reorient toward the Will-O-Wisp floating several meters distant. But the effort was too much. Its body wasn't responding appropriately to commands. Neurological damage from the spiritual heat had interrupted connections that allowed coordinated movement. And before it could even begin a final desperate attack, Leora finished it. It was merciful in a certain sense. The Will-O-Wisp enveloped the mantis completely, but without additional explosion this time, simply applying constant heat that forced Ren to sever the bond before damage became permanent. The mantis disappeared into light particles. Ren felt the emptiness where the bond had been, that familiar but never comfortable void that came from losing connection with a beast. Now he only had the Wolverine left, his third and in many aspects most versatile creature. And although the Will-O-Wisp was spent, mass reduced, and energy clearly depleted after using such a costly technique, he still had to face the bash. Chapter 829, Taming the Fifth Year, Spirit of the Torch 5. That massive serpent Leora had deliberately saved for the end, knowing it would pose the most serious threat when her opponent was already worn down and running low on options. The beast that could absorb mana from fallen creatures and strengthen itself exponentially as the battle progressed. And Ren would have to face it with only a single beast, after having lost both the Hydra and the Mantis in battles that had pushed him harder than anything else during this exam had managed. The silence in the stands was absolute as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Ren Patender, who had seemed invincible throughout the entirety of the exams, was now in a position where defeat wasn't just possible, but probable if Leora executed properly with her final beast. Ren's parents clenched their fists at the growing tension. His mother's breathing had become shallow, each exhale measured and controlled as if she could somehow channel calm to her son through sheer force of will. His father's jaw worked silently, muscles twitching beneath his weathered skin. Taro watched from his recovery cot, the healers having at least dulled the worst of his pain. His expression mixed genuine concern for his friend with a hint of satisfaction at having contributed to creating a situation where his victory wasn't guaranteed. He'd done his part. Now, it was up to Leora to handle what came next. Min was biting his fingers, supporting Leora. Funnily enough, his partner, Luna, wanted Ren to win, even if she wanted to support Leora too. Larissa was the same as Luna, but a bit more invested in Ren for her own silly small discourse about second-place draw. Lou had thought of it too, but now was happy about not having said it out loud. Most of Ren's friends were Leora friends too. Everyone was invested. Throughout the arena, whispers began to spread like wildfire through dry grass. The noble families leaned toward each other, speaking behind raised hands and fans. The commoner sections buzzed with speculation and debate. Betting odds were being frantically recalculated in the back rows. The end was approaching, and nobody could predict with certainty how it would go. Ren's Wolverine was still at Silver 3. He'd been cultivating it at that level for more than 300 days already, with approximately 3 additional months required before it would finally reach gold rank. It was a calculation Ren had made many times recently with anticipation, because the Wolverine would ascend on the exact same day the Mantis would reach Silver 1. That synchronization wasn't completely accidental, but rather the result of obtaining it just as his mushroom reached gold, exactly 100 days before promoting his Wolverine to Silver 3. This meant they would share advancement dates in the future, making it easier for Ren to keep track of the countdowns. 3 months from now, he'd have 3 gold-rank beasts and 1 silver beast. The costs and waiting times were becoming quite lengthy indeed. Ren missed the lower levels where the base of 100 days wasn't yet multiplied by the achieved mayor ranks. In those early times when his beasts were in iron or bronze ranks, progress had been relatively swift and the necessary resources manageable even for someone without extensive wealth. But reaching silver rank required double the base duration, 200 days instead of 100. And now in gold, it doubled again, 400 days of continuous cultivation for each level within the rank. It was the essential reason why maintaining high-level tamers operating effectively became increasingly expensive. It wasn't just a question of time, but of resources consumed during those extended periods, specialized materials, and controlled environments for their processing that accumulated costs exponentially as beasts ascended. Materials and mana that already cost 10 times more resources when advancing to the next major rank. Some noble families had even bankrupted themselves trying to cultivate too many tamers in upper ranks without the economic infrastructure to sustain it. That had been far more common in the past, before Ren's infallible cultivation methods. Back then, the weights and expenses could reach around double the cost with no guaranteed reward. At least Ren would never fail, and he no longer lacked wealth. Not even counting the rewards he'd practically already earned and the compensation that would come with that achievement. While he would have liked more time, that was a constant in any serious tamer's life. There was never enough time for everything you wanted to accomplish. You could only prioritize appropriately and execute with maximum possible efficiency. His Wolverine at gold rank would be considerably more powerful than the Hydra, at least until the Hydra developed more than 3 heads and unlocked the additional capabilities that came with that evolution. Simply because the Wolverine's elemental control was twice as improved as the Hydra's, something that came from the fundamental nature of the species. Wolverines were renowned for improved elemental manipulation rather than raw power, though they didn't lack that either, along with resistance. But few beasts lacked strength as they grew, and Wolverines didn't stand out excessively outside their elevated tenacity, something that could be underestimated since they had no shells or armor of any kind. Their skin was surprisingly resistant, though. But being a complete rank below the Hydra as it currently was, they were quite comparable in terms of overall combat effectiveness. The Wolverine compensated for the difference in raw strength and resistance with superior elemental versatility and more precise, powerful execution of complex techniques. It was a balance that made it difficult to predict which beast would have the advantage in direct confrontation without knowing the specific battle context. Leora wouldn't be easy to defeat now, especially with the bash still waiting after the wisp was handled. But Rin smiled as he prepared the manifestation of his third beast, an expression that communicated something beyond simple confidence in victory. Because in a certain way, this was more fun like this. A battle where the outcome wasn't guaranteed, where he had to push limits and execute with perfect precision to win. Besides, Rin had saved the best for last. While the Wolverine might be lower rank than the Hydra, it was still slightly better for the moment. And he was about to demonstrate exactly why. Chapter 830, Taming the Fifth Year, Weird Rainbow. The Wolverine materialized on the field with a presence that immediately captured the attention of every spectator. The beast was large now, substantially, a creature that reached nearly 3 meters in height at the shoulder when standing in its normal quadrupedal posture. Its weight had to be considerable, though it moved with a grace that belied its size. It was important to note that this still wasn't the largest Wolverine that existed in the kingdom. Being a popular species among the nobility for its elemental versatility, there were several specimens in gold rank distributed here and there among powerful families, not counting those belonging to Julius, Arturo, or Shizu. All of those were considerably larger than Ren's. But Ren's Wolverine was without doubt the strangest that most of the audience had ever seen. In general, its body followed the standard morphology of the species. It was somewhat elongated and muscular, an anatomy that communicated considerable strength compacted into a relatively compact frame. The legs were thick and powerful, built for both speed and stability. The shoulders were broad, supporting a neck that was thicker than it appeared at first glance. All Wolverines had a tail with long hairs that moved expressively, communicating the beast's emotional state. Relaxed and swaying meant contentment. Stiff and bristling signaled aggression. Tucked low indicated submission or fear, though few Wolverines ever exhibited that particular emotion. Their claws were large. Each digit ended in a slightly curved talon as long as a man's forearm. The difference from other normal Wolverines began with the fur. In typical specimens, the fur changed with the element the beast had developed as a preference, color and texture adjusting to reflect elemental affinity. A fire Wolverine would display red and orange tones, the fur taking on a quality that seemed to shimmer with heat even when the beast wasn't actively channeling. One aligned to water would show aquatic blues and greens, sometimes appearing slightly damp even in dry conditions. And so on for each element. Tamers who raised Wolverines guided them toward a single element early, focusing all cultivation efforts on developing that particular affinity to its maximum potential. Trying 2 or more would always end up with your beast stuck in a low rank, bronze or silver at most. A big part of the audience understood this almost instinctively. On the back and head, Wolverines had longer multicolored hairs when young. As they rose in rank and adapted to their preferred element, those hairs gradually changed into physical manifestations of the element itself. If the Wolverine leaned toward earth, those hairs converted into mineral structures that grew like crystalline spines. In fire types, they became perpetual flames that burned without consuming. In wood-attuned specimens, they first transformed into grass, and then into small trees as the beast grew larger. It was a distinctive characteristic of the species that allowed immediate identification of which element a Wolverine had prioritized during its development, which brought everyone to the truly strange situation of Ren's Wolverine, something that made it unique among all known specimens. There was a moment of confused silence as some observers tried to process what they were seeing. Why is it green? And what element is that? Someone said in the stands. I can't tell, another responded, squinting. It's multiple. That's impossible. Wolverines don't work that way. But the impossible was no more. The evidence stood before them in the arena. The best way to describe it would be as an unconventional rainbow mounted on a small jade mountain. The wolverine's back fur was a deep, lustrous black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Shadow element. Clearly, though that alone would have been unusual enough. Shadow-attuned wolverines were not attainable, at least not the last 500 years. But that was just the beginning, or the end. Well, the tail. Interspersed throughout the black fur were patches and streaks of white transparent hair that seemed to glow faintly with an inner radiance. Light element. The direct opposite of shadow, the yang to its yin. Having both shouldn't be possible even there. They were contradictory forces that typically canceled each other out or caused cultivation instability. Yet Ren's wolverine displayed both in perfect balance. But that wasn't that weird anymore for a Ren's beast. There was more. The longer hairs along its back and head told an even stranger story. They hadn't transformed into a single element as nature intended. Instead, they become a spectrum of elemental manifestations, each distinct and clearly developed. Red-orange flames danced along portions of the spine, actual fire that burned without heat reaching the fur beneath. Fire element, fully achieved and controlled. Blue sections near the shoulders appeared liquid, water droplets that somehow remained suspended and flowing despite defying gravity. Water element, impossible to miss. Yellow crystalline formations jutted from other areas, mineral structures that caught the light and refracted it in rainbow patterns. Earth element, solid and unyielding. Brown-green growth sprouted in patches, actual living plants that seemed to draw sustenance from the beast itself. Wood element, vibrant and healthy. Silver-white wisps of moving air surrounded the head, visible currents that shifted and flowed with the wolverine's movements. Wind element, restless and free. 7 elements total, not specialized in one, not even split between 2 or 3, which would have been remarkable enough. All 7 elements, each manifested, existing in harmony on a single beast. Not 5 elements, as would be the case with a legendary wolverine from the old stories that had cultivated affinity with all natural elements, but 7 complete elements including light and darkness, which were normally the exclusive domain of other specialized species. On the back of Ren's jade-green wolverine, the elemental transformations displayed themselves in an exhibition that gave everyone plenty to talk about and left little to hide regarding the beast's capabilities. It was obvious even to a casual observer that there were 7 different varieties manifested instead of the 5 that an extraordinarily versatile legendary wolverine might show. And although Run had never used the wolverine with its complete repertoire before such a large public audience, the physical manifestations on the beast's back communicated the nearly undeniable truth about its capabilities, which was why the hidden observer's report in the stands had escalated to 99.999% certainty. All of Ren's beasts could use the 7 complete traditional elements, including light and darkness, despite the observer not yet having seen the wolverine execute techniques with their own eyes. The physical evidence was sufficient to confirm what the battle with his Hydra and Mantis had strongly suggested. The implications rippled through the crowd like waves through still water. In the noble sections, house leaders exchanged glances weighted with meaning. A tamer who could have more than 2 and cultivate all multi-element beasts wasn't just rare, it was unprecedented. The strategic value alone made Ren Patender a prize worth considerable investment, or alternatively, a threat worth neutralizing before he became too powerful to control. The merchants in the upper middle sections saw contracts, partnerships, exclusive rights to his services. The calculations were already running through their minds, profit margins expanding with each passing second. The common sections simply stared in awe. This was the kind of tamer that stories were written about, the kind that changed the game entirely.